I think we're live, and I'd like to welcome everyone. There may be big news today in American politics, but it ain't nothing compared to this, which is so much bigger in significance. It's an opportunity for us to celebrate Eric Alterman with his new book, Lying in State: Why Presidents Lie and Why Trump is Worse. And we're going to spend, my name is Leonard Bernardo, by the way. I'm a vice president at the Open Society Foundations, who is hosting this event. And I should say that we're going to talk for around 45 minutes, give or take, and then we have enough time for another 45 minutes of questions. Those questions that you would like to share with Eric and Maya and me should be sent to questions at Open Society Foundations, plural.org. Questions at OpenSocietyFoundations.org. You can also do this via Twitter, and you could also, if you really need to, do it via Facebook. We are recording this event. It's being live cast, and it's going to be quite a show. We have someone I have known and admired for a very long time, Maya Wiley, with us as a discussant. Maya, who's been a very long time civil rights lawyer, an activist, former chair of New York City's Civilian Complaint Review Board, former corporation counsel to His Honor, William de Blasio, currently a university professor at the New School, and an ongoing legal analyst at both NBC News and MSNBC. And so a great pleasure, Maya, to be with you here. And the person of honor, Eric Alterman, who is a distinguished professor at Brooklyn College in the English faculty, a person who has had a fortnightly column in The Nation since I think I was in diapers, but it continues going on liberal media. Eric has been the recipient of a surfeit of fellowships and awards over the years, testament to his important work as a journalist, as an historian, has written many books, from Bruce Springsteen to liberalism to the perfidy of American media, and then this question of presidential lying that we're going to interrogate today. So welcome, Eric, welcome, Maya, and welcome everyone who has joined this live cast. I thought, Eric, I could begin by a pretty general opening question to you about why it is that you wrote this book, what you learned from this, because you wrote a dissertation on lying some years ago at Stanford that became a book some 15 years ago on lying. So what made you return to the theme of mendacity, looking across the gamut of American history, and what did you get out of this? So over to you, Eric.
Thank you so much, Lenny. Thank you, Maya. I'm deeply honored by your presence here. I mean that. And thank you to the foundations, of course. Yeah, well, I appreciate that question because it's a meaningful question to me, why I wrote this book. I actually was under contract to write a different book when the shock of Donald Trump's election took place. And that January, I went away for my birthday with my daughter for a little vacation, and I was reading Ron Chernow's book on the Warburg family, a very important, wealthy German Jewish family, a significant number of whom remained in Germany throughout the Hitler years and ended up dying one way or another. And I wasn't, in my mind, comparing Trump to Hitler. Still am not. But I was amazed at all the different signs that that they were able to ignore and convince the family in convincing themselves that everything was going to be okay when it was not going to be okay. And I had this thought then that I wanted to account for myself in this period of Trump's presidency, because it was something so unusual and no one knew where it was going to go. And I thought, well, what do I know? I know presidential lying because I wrote my dissertation and my previous book which was a case study of 4 presidential lies. It wasn't like this book, which begins with George Washington and goes through Donald Trump. So I thought that's the contribution I could make. And that way, when my daughter, who just graduated college, no pressure, but when she has children one day, and they say, Daddy, what did you do during the Trump presidency? I'll hand them this book. But that's actually how it happened. And now I'm back to work on the original book. To answer the second part of your question, I'll tell you, like I said, I have a PhD in American history. I've written a lot of books that are mostly history books. Even the Springsteen book is kind of a history book. But and most of my writing has been either about the media or about U.S. foreign policy. So the Cold War and empire and the way that made presidents lie, I knew that. That didn't shock me. I was ready for that. What shocked me is the centrality of white supremacy in the history of of the need for presidential lying. If you ask me, in the pre-Trump period, what are the 2 main drivers of presidential lies? Number 1 is white supremacy, because we are not actually a nation where all men are created equal, or much less all men and women are created equal. We are a nation where a lot of people have to be put in inferior places so that other people can feel superior to them. And that's been a constant theme of American history, from slavery through the expansion into Latin America, into the Philippines, et cetera, et cetera. It all had to be done in that context, that for a president couldn't tell the truth about how the people who were non-white were being treated, because it was in direct contradiction with the fundamental myth of this country. And the second driving force, which changes slightly over time, and maybe has changed fundamentally under Trump, we can talk about that later, begins with the need for constant expansion that began very early with Jefferson and Lewis and Clark and so forth, and becomes, when we run out of territory to expand in North America, Frederick Jackson Turner's great thesis, which I believe was 1896, we start expanding overseas and become an empire. And then following World War II, we get this definition of national security, which encompasses our empire, but is completely limitless. And that, again, that idea of constant expansion, of empire, of the fact that other countries are not allowed to take their own form of government because it conflicts with our idea of national security, that also conflicts with the myths that we're taught as school children and we're expected to believe in, that our politicians always say. So all of these things come together and they trap presidents into lies. Almost no presidents have been able to avoid the formula of having to lie about white supremacy and empire/national security.
So Eric, let me just push you a little bit on the question of lying specifically, because what you just described in terms of manifest destiny, in terms of at least the implication, the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, forms of white supremacy that have been pervasive throughout American history, this, of course, is nothing new. Tell me what you feel is new or novel or distinct about this master category of lying that is going to add to the broader understanding, even if synthetically, of American history.
Well, first of all, I want to say this is alcohol. This is a vodka martini, and this is supposed to be, for me anyway, a celebration of this 3 years I put into this book, 4 years. And I'm just so grateful to the world that no other important news was produced today, so everybody can focus on this important event. I was worried about that, but it's okay. I haven't looked at my computer in a while. Listen, when a president lies, I mean, people lie a lot. People have no idea how common lying is. Most people don't think of themselves as liars, but almost everybody lies pretty frequently. Shocker here, men lie more often to make themselves feel better, and women lie to assuage other people's feelings. As a rule, although obviously there are exceptions. When a president lies, it's different than any other kind of lie because president's rhetoric creates its own form of reality. And when a president lies, people react to it, and instead of reacting to what the president is lying about, they react to the lies, and so they end up dealing with the problem that has been lied about, whereas the initial problem that the president was lying about goes unaddressed, and so you have you create a dynamic whereby you have to keep lying because you have let the problem fester. Now, I don't want to jump all the way to Donald Trump, but I'm going to just for 1 minute. What I found so interesting last week about one of Trump's countless lies was when he was asked about the explosion in Lebanon. He said, well, he talked to some great generals, and they told him that it was probably an attack, a bomb. And like everybody ignored it because no one takes him seriously anymore, even though he's president of the United States. Like, you just forget it. Like, did anyone say, oh, we have to investigate the terror attack? Everybody said, oh, that's just this lunatic in the White House. So this is a new situation, and it has there are a lot of problems associated with it, but there are different problems than we've faced in the past. Any other president who said that, it would be a crisis.
Yeah. So let me, if I could, Eric, and thank you for that helpful clarification. Let me turn to Maya, and I'm wondering, Maya, if we do think about Trump for a second. I don't think any of us here believe in the great person theory of history, the kind of Tom Brokaw, Douglas Brinkley model. I think we all recognize that there are huge structural preconditions and structural pressures that enable somebody like Donald Trump to exist. Awful as some may say he may be. I'm wondering, Maya, if you can talk a little bit about those enabling conditions in terms of what created the opportunities for someone like Trump to be the, as it were, prevaricator in chief.
Well, thank you, Lenny. But I also just want to say congratulations, Eric. As someone whose writing I've always appreciated and enjoyed and learned from, this is an important and exciting book at an important time. So thank you. And also, thank you, Lenny. It's like a homecoming to be part of one of these events. And I wanted to just say happy birthday, George Soros. So someone who has been the victim of lying, and in particular, lying that is embedded in anti-Semitism. So when we talk about the structures, I think it's critical that we talk about, and by the way, this is something that is in Eric's book. So I'm not going to tell you all the things it says, so you go out and buy it. But there is some really important information in the book around some of these structures. And some of them include the fact, and we just saw it recently play out in the impeachment hearing of Donald Trump, that we have a party system that has essentially failed to hold its own accountable. And that kind of Faustian deal that we've seen is really a degradation of a democratic process that was unlike what we saw, say, with Nixon, the tremendous liar in Watergate, right? Where the party was willing to say, we have to protect the institutions of democracy, not the person of the president. And the shift that we've seen, and the book speaks to some critical components of this shift, was less about whether the Republican establishment loved Donald Trump. It was the willingness to embrace him despite not liking him because of the fear of the base that very much voted for and accepted a Donald Trump as a liar. Because I think one of the things that's striking to me about Donald Trump is he always lied. He was lying about birtherism years before he ran for president. It was racist. It was Remember Ben Smith, full disclosure, a friend of mine, but Ben Smith wrote to his staff about what they could say on social media during the campaign, that they could say Donald Trump was a mendacious racist because it was a factual statement. That's an astounding thing for a newsroom editor to say to staff around facts, right? And how important it was to have someone in the media willing to make that kind of statement and stand by it when it got publicized beyond his newsroom. And Eric really points to the way in which even some longtime, very conservative commentators like a Charlie Sykes, like a George Will, have kind of bemoaned the fact that there has been a rise of an echo chamber that has become part of a disinformation system of quote unquote news reporting, as if there is something called neutrality in the context of bold-faced lies, and that the difficulty that newsrooms have had in calling them out. So I think there are really multiple things to look at, but I also really want to underscore what Eric has said about racism, because there's no question that, in my view, that the core of the white supremacist model that has helped enable a Donald Trump to the White House, which includes voter suppression, by the way, and very intentional efforts to undermine the vote, which may explain why he's even in the White House to begin with, was certainly undergirded by his break from the Southern strategy. Because remember, the Southern strategy, part of the lying in history around white supremacy was, we're going to uphold it, but we'll use dog whistles. We'll use only those phrases and terms that that folks who want to uphold white supremacy can hear, and those who are offended by it won't hear it, and we'll get away with it. And Donald Trump really broke that model. What he did is he said, I'm going to be upfront and in your face with my racism, but I'll be an economic populist. And that was the break from the tradition Republican model of we'll be covert in appealing to those who espouse white supremacy, but we'll also be fiscal conservatives, and we'll be, globalists in the sense of free market economies. That was the deal that Donald Trump broke, and it worked.
Yeah. Can I ask Maya? You touched on the question of some journalists. You mentioned Ben Smith. In Eric's book, as you say, he cites a number of journalists. He takes Peter Baker a bit to task because, to your mind, Eric, lying is not just about intentionality. And so many journalists, as I think you correctly note, feel that they have to maintain some notion, as Maya was saying, of neutrality because they can't necessarily prove intent. And so in your book, you take a more capacious sense of lying. You include disinformation, misinformation, and the like, and not just intent. And I'm wondering if we spoke to some of those self-respecting journalists that Maya just mentioned, would they accept your more capacious sense? What would the journalist field itself think about how you're approaching lying?
Well, journalists in the mainstream media would reject it outright, which is one reason I wrote the book. That inability to point out that the president just spoke a falsehood at the time the president is speaking it is what has empowered not only Trump but other presidents to get away with literally murder. And the fact that, I would say, Maya made a lot of important points that I'd like to try and speak to as well as I try and answer your question. If you look at the first century and a half of American history, the lies that the president told were kind of consensus lies. You mentioned earlier Manifest Destiny. William Polk was actually, doesn't get talked about a lot, but he was the most consequential liar of that period. The man who tried to hold him to account, interestingly, I think it's one of the most interesting parts of the book, was Abraham Lincoln, a two-term congressman who lost his job for that reason. He didn't run for re-election because he had become a dissident by trying to hold Polk accountable in the Mexican-American War. But for most of this period, Manifest Destiny, and this expansionary period and keeping the world safe for democracy under Wilson, there were dissidents, but there was a consensus on behalf of the lies that were told. Things began to break with Ronald Reagan, I would say, because Nixon was held to account. Nixon, the system worked, albeit belatedly, but it worked. But with Ronald Reagan, Reagan would lie. He would speak nonsense all the time. And I want to give a hat tip, if that's not a sexist term, to Maya, on the racist dog whistle thing, because Reagan announced. Maya, do you remember what town it was he announced in? It was Mississippi,
Philadelphia,
right?
Mississippi, where Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were murdered.
Right. So he happened to announce that day and endorse states' rights, I believe, in that very speech, as if he wasn't saying anything. And it was obvious what he was saying. And yet the media, the people in the media, for a variety of reasons, are so cautious about holding the president to account. They respect the office. They're afraid of the crap they get from the right wing working the refs. They're afraid of getting blamed if something goes wrong in the area of national security. So the president has historically had an incredibly wide berth to lie and to use these racist dog whistles, which amount to lying, because racism. So in the case of Reagan, he would say all this nonsense. Like Reagan told people he had liberated the concentration camps when he had never left California. And the excuse was, well, he makes up these stories and he believes them, and he's disengaged. That was a word that was invented for Reagan. Calvin Trillin, my friend, came up with the idea of a disengaged blonde. But Reagan got away with all of this because the media were not willing to take on the president and say this is nonsense. Whether you call it a lie or something else, it doesn't matter. You have to, at the moment the president says something that's false, call it out as false. Otherwise, it becomes true because the president said it. So Reagan began by speaking nonsense, and the media, who were shocked very much by Reagan's election the same way they were shocked by Trump's election, were afraid to take him on. So I would say that the current moment that we're living in, it began with Ronald Reagan. It then took an enormous jump forward with Newt Gingrich, who recognized that if he was going to use the most outlandish language and craziest accusations, and I want to recommend my friend Julian Zeltzer's new book on Newt Gingrich on this topic. It just came out a few weeks ago. That again, the press would do what they had done, what they'd always done, what they did with Joe McCarthy. They would say, Newt Gingrich says you're a commie, good-for-nothing, liar, homosexual, whatever. What do you say? And you say, I'm not one of those, any of those things. And then the press prints both sides and lets the reader decide. So I don't think that's useful. And it clearly is not useful once you get Donald Trump, who says, when he started running for president, saying the president was not born in this country, and that global warming is a plot to destroy American manufacturing made up by the Chinese. Not only did he say that, he then lied about having said that, which he did in the debate with Hillary Clinton. And he said it hundreds of times. And yet the media, what they've decided to do about these lies is either print both sides. Trump says this, Obama says, no, I was born in this country. Or they print fact-checking columns somewhere else. Newspapers print fact-checking columns. Television and broadcast basically get away with it. But it doesn't work unless you point out that it's not true in the time and place that the president is saying. Otherwise, again, because the president said it, it takes on a life of its own. And I give Donald Trump credit. He's a lying genius. Even recently, people have been talking about the great interviews that Chris Wallace did and Jonathan Swan did. I could go over those interviews and point out dozens and dozens of lies that went unanswered in those, because no one can keep up with this man's ability to lie. And his lies are so embedded in our culture that it's like a swamp to try and break through them. And
So
and,
Eric,
and so
Eric, let's
yeah.
let's just, if I could. No. It was great. It was great. Let's just zoom out for a second, because we are swimming in a sea of lies, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda is enveloping us at every level, at every turn. And so I'm wondering, Maya, your thoughts on how the hell do we get out of this morass? Because my feeling, and I've said this before at the foundation, is that there is no silver bullet. We are not returning to some idyllic era which actually never existed. It's a matter of how do we deal with, tamp down where necessary, misinformation and disinformation, but we're not going to transcend it. We're not going to overcome it. I'm curious, Maya, where you see all of what Eric is talking about in terms of fundamental lies by executive office holders, and then the world of disinformation that we inhabit right now. What do you see the future looking like?
I think it looks like my cat, and I think all roads lead to my cat. Seriously, it's a very important question, and I think a lot of the analysis that Eric is pointing to and that's in the book, in a sense, can be translated also into a roadmap, meaning it is certainly encouraging, and we should be encouraged by the fact that we have a national discussion, for example, about what is truth and what are lies. I mean, unfortunately, it's in a context of a Donald Trump who lies so frequently, but the fact that we have a Washington Post running a running catalog of over, what, are we up to 18,000? I've lost track.
20,000.
20,000 lies and misleading statements from the President of the United States. I think the fact that we have seen, and I think we are seeing the public start to respond to the accountability of elected leaders on protecting the institutions of democracy as part of that. I don't think we can get away from some of the underlying research that points to, for example, why people are more likely to believe conspiracy theories, for example. And anxiety is a huge psychological predictor of the willingness to believe in conspiracies. And by the way, conspiracy belief isn't rooted in one particular ideology or another. There are left-wing conspiracy theories, there are right-wing conspiracy theories, and all manner in the middle. But the ability for American people to both get acknowledgement and validation on anxiety, to get an ability to be supported in having more human connection, particularly to people who are different. I mean, we're more segregated now than we've been in years, and we've been going in the wrong direction on racial segregation, for example. But it also means that we're not having the kind of experiences with one another that create the form of relationships that also help us navigate some of the lies we tell about other people. And I think in this context, for instance, of Donald Trump, Eric outlines some of these lies in the book around caging children and the flat out denial of our lying eyes in the form of seeing the images, and of him claiming it was the policies of the past. But there was a very troubling trend in some of the opinion research that showed that there were some Americans who actually saw this as rational policy. So not even whether it was truth or not truth, but the dehumanization of some people in the world who, instead of being seen as folks that are experiencing a humanitarian crisis and something as basic as parental rights.
Whoops.
We lost Maya for a moment. Let's just give her 3 seconds. I know that she's having a little bit of internet problem. All right, Eric, let me just, as we wait for Maya to come back in, just, it could be the cat. It could be the cat. Let me just raise with you, Eric, something that Maya was saying, and it's a sort of more sort of normative set of questions. What would you like at the end of the day? Because you're both a journalist, Eric, and you're an historian, right? You produced both the first draft of history and the 97th draft of history. Not many people are able to do both. But what would you like ultimately from a prescriptive, to the extent that you want to be prescriptive, aspect? What would you like people reading this book to come away with, outside of simply everyone lies? Is there anything prescriptive you want people to learn from this?
Well, you know, I'm also a professor, and I've been to college, and I remember how little I remember from what I learned in college as a professor. So the first thing I say on the first day of class is, I say three things. Number one, I teach them the difference between was and were. Then I teach them the difference between less and fewer. I'm an English professor, so I say, I want you to learn these two grammatical things. And then I say, I don't expect you to remember really any of the facts you learned in this class, but I want you to learn critical thinking. I want you to be able to evaluate your sources. And that's what my work is all about, really. It's about how to choose who you're going to believe and live your life on the basis of those beliefs. And it's hard work. Like, I've been very lucky. You know, when I was in college, I had a column in the college newspaper, and I had great professors. One of them, a hero to me, Walter Lefebvre, blurbed this book. It's very meaningful to me. It's one of the meaningful things about this book. And I basically have the same job I had when I was in college. And on the one hand, I'm studying history and trying to make sense of how we got to be where we are and how I got to be who I am. And on the other hand, I'm trying to apply that history to day-to-day events. And it's very interesting. I've written about this. It's a big word. I use it in college, epistemology. There's a conflict in the epistemological assumptions of journalists and historians. The most insulting thing you can say to a historian is that he's just a journalist. And the most insulting thing that an editor will say to a journalist is, this is history. But in fact, you can't understand journalism without history, and vice versa. So I have this nice little niche in my life where I try to do both at once. But if you ask me what is my prescription for journalism, number one it would be to survive, because that's a big problem right now. Let's not leave that aside. Journalism has experienced many simultaneous crises. But it would be two things. It would be, number one, what is the context of the issue that you're talking about? Not what did he say and what did she say, but what is the overall context? Not even what is news. I don't care what's new. The word news is the plural of new. New is not necessarily what's important. What's important is what does it mean? And the second question is, what is true? What do you believe to be true? Don't tell me what this guy says is true and that guy says is true, because there's a third person and a fourth person you're not quoting. And also, truth is very complicated. What we want from our journalism is people who have spent a lot of time trying to understand an issue and can explain it to us and tell us what is reality, to make what Walter Lippmann called the pictures in our head match the world outside. It's hard work. I don't deny that. And the problem is that is antithetical in both cases, both to the work of the historian and to the work of the journalist, because journalism is about what's new and historians are about like working so hard to get things exactly right so that by the time you get them, they no longer matter. So I try and do my work in this netherworld. This book is it's got like, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 footnotes. And some of those footnotes are mine because I wrote a dissertation a long time ago on this topic. But mostly I'm relying on other historians because they've done the work. And I had a fact checker to make sure I got the quotes right and so forth. But I'm trying to apply the lessons of history to our contemporary situation. And when you do that, it's a very different picture than you get even in the best newspapers on their best days.
Yeah. And as an English professor, not to correct you, Eric, but there are actually endnotes, I think, in this particular book. But that's neither here nor there. Let's keep going. I would like, if it's all right, we got a lot of questions, a lot of good questions that have been pouring in. And if it's all right, Maya and Eric, I'd like to begin with a couple. And we'll do them maybe 2 by 2, but maybe some of them we'll do singly. But we have someone that Eric actually mentioned earlier, just sent in, Julian Zelizer, who teaches at Princeton. He's in the history faculty. There's also an analyst with CNN. Julian asks, as we evaluate the legacy of presidents, does the consequence of a presidential lie matter? If there is not a great policy consequence, like Vietnam after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, is it less significant? I think I might just stop there before the next. That's a big question. Maya, Eric, please.
Maya, you go ahead.
Well, I'm Black in America. And what that means is there are always consequences, but sometimes they're not immediate. Because sometimes there are consequences that have to be of our making. And I say that with all honesty, that coming from a community that has to force reckoning with the history we were talking about earlier, force reckoning with a kind of a white supremacy that continues to manifest itself today.
Whoops.
Just lost Maya for a second. She's going to come back again. Eric, just pick up.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I've got 2 answers on different levels. One is, I mentioned in the introduction of my book, it's all consequences. If you look at how historians rate past presidents, lying has nothing to do with it all. Big liars are at the top. And people who hardly lied, Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama, they're not at the top. And it's all about who was successful. So historians, as well as the public, are very much willing to forgive lies as long as they work out. I wish that weren't the case, but it's definitely the case. Now, a friend of mine, a historian, Michael Kazin, wrote me today at Georgetown, and he asked me, didn't Roosevelt lie in the 1940s about getting us into war? He wanted to get us into war against the Nazis, and the country didn't want, wasn't interested. And it reminds me of a famous quote from Senator Fulbright, who said that Roosevelt lied in a noble way, and Lyndon Johnson told an almost perfectly analogous lie that got us into Vietnam, which was a catastrophe. Now, when I wrote my first book on presidential lying, I said presidents should never lie, and I'm taking that back. Read the book, it's a good book, but that part I'm taking back, because Roosevelt definitely lied to save civilization. I can't say presidents should never lie. I'm glad Roosevelt lied about his intentions to get us into war. I'm glad he lied to get us into war, which he did. Although Lyndon Johnson did very much the same thing and got us into a catastrophic war. John Kennedy, very interesting case. He lied about solving the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was much more dovish than he admitted to, and that he even is understood to be today. He made a deal with the Russians that he swore, and everyone in his cabinet swore he didn't make, and he would have made an even weaker deal if he had to. He was going to prevent that nuclear catastrophe no matter what, and he did exactly the right thing. Interestingly, he lied about making the deal. And Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, never knew about the lie, never knew about the deal, secret deal. And so Johnson was living under the myth that Kennedy had been eyeball to eyeball with the Russians and didn't blink. And he went into Vietnam eyeball to eyeball and didn't blink, and because he felt like he had to. This actually was the reason I wrote my first book, because of that particular lie. And we got caught up in Vietnam because he had to be just as macho as his predecessor. So lying is a very complicated matter. And like I said, you can't just rule it. You can't just say don't lie, because we lie all the time. I mean, in the very beginning of the book, I talk about going to Hebrew school, where we're taught how great it was that Jacob lied about his birthright to his father Isaac to steal it from Esau. And then, of course, there'd be no Moses if the midwives hadn't lied about the Israelite child that they had saved. Lies can be noble lies, and we understand that. It's very hard to understand the consequences of lying before the lie takes place. But I think the job of journalists and intellectuals is to defend the truth. Like you can't worry about whether it's a good lie or a bad lie. The job of scholars and intellectuals is to defend the truth, to defend the language. One thing that Donald Trump has is really should go to jail for. He should go to language jail. He's so promiscuous with language, even though he only knows a few words. He misuses them so frequently that it's hard to make sense of what he just said. And the if you think about words in a kind of bubble, we're all like collapsing on one another, and that's part of what he gets away with. Everyone always talks about the Washington Post fact checkers. I really admire the one guy CNN hired away from the Toronto Star named Daniel Dale, who doesn't get the credit he deserves because he does it all by himself for CNN. Fascinatingly, CNN allows lies 90% of the time, and then they print Daniel Dale saying, "Oh, that was all lies." But Daniel Dale has pointed out that what the media have done for the first 3 years of Trump's presidency is make him make a lot more sense than he really does. When he gives these speeches and press conferences, he's basically speaking nonsense. And the press, when they cover the stories, they make it sound sensible. I want to give a shout out to, I wish my close personal friend, Sarah Cooper, who I've never met, but she's watching, I'd like to be friends with you, Sarah Cooper, because she has shown us how crazy the man sounds when you actually when you actually see his words in a row. And I would say that Trump, even when he's not exactly lying, is lying because he's manipulating the language in such a way that the truth becomes invisible. And he's doing it on purpose.
So Eric, let me jump in here. I know Maya's back, but this is a perfect moment to segue into a question we just got from the great Joe Conason, the great journalist Joe Conason, and Joe writes, very much on point here. Does the electorate give a hoot? That was my paraphrase.
Yes.
About presidential lying. Do they care, or do voters only care about the topics that may elicit presidential lies? What do you think, Maya?
Well, I think people do care about lies about things they care about. And I think that goes to some of the points that Eric was already making. And they don't care about lies if they just want the president to do what the president is doing. We saw that there was a great comedy routine where one of the comedians was going out into an audience of Trump supporters, and the Trump supporters said, I stand by my president because, and then said something that was exactly not what President Trump said or stood for. And when the voter was confronted with the fact that there was a total mismatch between what the voter was saying and what Trump had said, then the voter says, well, I don't care. So yes, there is a group of people who will support no matter what. But I think, as we've seen, and we should not forget this, the vast majority of Americans are expressing real concern. The problem is that either the leadership, because of the way we've had gerrymandering, because we have broken fundamentally how people's voice and votes get registered and count in elections, that dilutes their objection and their voice when it comes to these kinds of lies, particularly on things that are important to a diverse American public. So unless we're willing to address the fact that since at least 2010, we have had an outright and intentional attack on the voting rights of people of color in this country because of who they're more likely to vote for, that has deeply undermined the ability of the American public to register in a way that counts with elected officials their concerns about lying. I think that can change, but as we've already seen the seeds of lies and misinformation being sown around mail-in balloting as an effort to try to erode the ability of the American public to take control back by exercising their rights. And that we have to confront, and we do that by doing, and I apologize for getting cut off thanks to my bad Optimum cable, but that the reality is, it's a struggle that we have had since the beginning of the country, is to make our elected officials reflect our values and our beliefs in a way that is a pluralistic democracy that we in fact are.
Great. That was an Optimum cable anti-plug. But let me ask let me ask Eric, if you're on board with what Maya just thoughtfully said about whether the electorate gives a hoot about presidential lying.
I don't think there is an electorate anymore. I don't think we really are a country, a single country anymore. I think we've divided ourselves into separate fiefdoms, in part thanks to the media, Rupert Murdoch and Fox, and now Breitbart, etc. These people live in their own world, and they're incredibly dedicated, and they cause a lot of trouble for individuals who go against them, and also for the rest of the media. This is part of what I wrote about in my book, What Liberal Media and Working the Refs. They hassle people so much that it's not worth taking them on, and in doing so, they move the center of American politics further and further to the right, into their own territory. So even though you have a right-wing media, which is Fox and Breitbart and everything else, Ben Shapiro and all these other organizations now, but the mainstream media has also moved with them, because Fox makes a lot of money. It's still the highest rated program on cable, period. So the media, they're in business. They're chasing after the same viewers. So the fact that now, I mean, isn't it absurd that Donald Trump thinks he can win the election by defending Confederate statues? I mean, who's dedicated to Confederate statues? Even the military and the Republican Party are saying, get rid of them. But Trump thinks it's a winner. How can that possibly be a winner? Even if you have these horrible politics that, you think Obama was born in Kenya, why would you really care? I mean, who really cares about Confederate statues? Particularly, we have a coronavirus and we have 20% unemployment, all kinds of problems. And the reason is because you're living in this bubble that is entirely epistemologically controlled by people who are there to A, support Donald Trump, and B, teach you that the three of us are evil and trying to destroy you and out to get you, and anti-religious and anti-God. And it's become impossible to break through that bubble. Impossible. It just has to be defeated. But it's like Democrats are still living in the old world, and most of the mainstream media are still living in the old world, where you speak to the country about shared values, and you appeal to traditional points of patriotism, and that does move, I think, most people. But as Maya says, and we've seen, like in recently in Georgia and Kansas, they can control Wisconsin too, where my daughter just graduated. They could control the voting process to the point where a tiny minority, the kinds of people who care. I mean, does anyone know anyone who cares about Confederate monuments? I don't know anyone. But these people can actually, this tiny minority can control the future of the country and even destroy our democracy. Can our country survive another 4 years of Donald Trump as a democracy? I don't think so. That's it. That's one point. The second interesting point that's been made by others is that no one in the world thinks that Donald Trump is going to win a popular election in the next election. You can't get any sensible person to say that. And yet, we're not sure he's not going to win. And that's because he's been so successful at degrading the vulnerable aspects of our democratic processes. I think this is a crisis. I would like to see our mainstream media treat this as a crisis. But I get too much on the one hand, on the other hand.
Got it. I should just say, because I want to turn to an excellent question we got from someone actually at the University of Wisconsin-Madison about this question of democracy. Just want to underscore for everyone, of course, the Open Society Foundation's hosting this event is obviously a nonpartisan organization. But let me go to this question, if I can, Eric and Maya, from Chad Allen Goldberg, professor of sociology at UW-Madison, who talks about Robert Park, the great journalist, sociologist, Robert Park, who once wrote that the public institution should be responsive to public opinion in a democracy. But, quote, there can be no public opinion unless the persons who compose the public are able to live and think in the same world. So, Eric and Maya, what are the implications of presidential lying for the possibility of public opinion and the organization of a democratic public?
Well, I think Eric was speaking to this in the context of the Fox News echo chamber. I mean, let me just give you an anecdote, because it is really about where and how we access information and whether there's any factual grounding in that information. I remember driving between Biloxi and New Orleans for work post Hurricane Katrina. And the radio stations along the way, and all I was trying to do was pick up music stations, were by and large conservative radio. And in every single station I hit in that entire drive, I heard one set of facts and opinion, not multiple. And it was by and large one that painted immigrants as the worst possible thing that could happen to the country, particularly as immigrants who would steal our health care. And that was obviously not a factually based conversation. It was an emotional one, and it was a deeply troubling and racist one, in my view, because it stereotyped a whole group of people. But it also became fundamentally what we started to see in the organizing against healthcare reform as a dominant narrative. And in those communities, there were not multiple sources of information and news. And if you go to some parts of rural Arizona or rural other parts of the country that are rural, there is often not more than one source of information. And that it makes it impossible if there is only a bubble of information that is not fact-based, that is emotional, that is opinion, that is not grounded, and which doesn't enable an actual conversation with real people who have different experiences. And I think that's fundamentally the challenge.
Brilliant. Eric, anything additional on that?
Yeah, I think I second everything Maya just said. There's a whole section of the country that never hears anything but what fits into their preconceived beliefs, and because that's profitable, there's no way to break in. There's no way to break into it. The second thing, though, when I wrote the book, when I began it in 2016, I was very wary of using the word fascism because it's such an explosive term. And you saw it a little bit. Some scholars were saying there's some similarities between this and fascism. But of course, this is not Nazi Germany. It's not Mussolini's Italy. But there are a lot of techniques that Trump is using. And I don't think Trump even knows what fascism is, academically speaking. I think he's just got a feel for it. But Hannah Arendt, who even though she's a rather disorganized thinker, she's got some really piercing things to say that have become truer and truer over time. And one of the points she makes that I couldn't help but reflect on in my conclusion is that if you destroy the idea of shared knowledge, of shared facts, then you can get away with anything. if you say, if Trump literally says, is one, I think the chapter on on Trump's presidency is called like, don't believe what you hear from these sons of bitches or something. It's a direct quote from the president. And if you destroy the idea of shared knowledge and shared facts, then you can say anything you want. And again, I don't think Trump read fascist theorists, although according to his ex-wife, he did keep a collection of Hitler's speeches by his bed. But he does that. He's appointed a whole group of people who do the same thing. William Barr does the same thing. On down the line, he's got some crazy guy, in the CIA, another one appointed into the military just recently. He's got Peter Navarro saying all kinds of nonsense this weekend in the press. And it's destroying a shared set of understandings about reality that we have. And again, it's the job of not just the media, but the entire establishment, all of us who are privileged enough to have voices and to have gone to college and to be heard in the discourse foundations, local government, to defend these things. And it's not happening. I mean, it's starting to happen a little bit belatedly now that it's become so obvious what he's trying to do. But it happened for 3 years, and everybody was like, the Dow is great. I mean, that's what he was betting on. And an enormous amount of damage has been done. And I'm not going to talk about elections because this is not the place for it. But I think we might just survive this moment, but I'm not sure. And my God, how did we get here? How do we get to this place that we have such a dysfunctional democracy compared to Germany and Italy, for goodness sakes? That's who those are the fascists we defeated.
But can I ask you just on and again, I don't want to talk about elections, the Open Study Foundation's being a nonpartisan institution. But if I can just raise one point, there was a really interesting documentary, and Eric, you were a really good talking head in it, on Lee Atwater, one of the spin doctors that took public debate and basically threw it into the abyss. We remember that '92 election with Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush seeking re-election, and that notorious, nefarious, racist episode around Willie Horton. I raised Lee Atwater because it struck me as a moment.
88.
That was 88. That was successful. That was when Bush won against Mike.
88. Sorry, that's right. 88. Sorry. But I raise Atwater, Eric and Maya, because it struck me as an inflection point where for the first time, and maybe it wasn't the first time, it seemed as if anything could be thrown against the wall, whether it's a lie, however egregious that lie is, and if it stuck, great. If it didn't, let's move on to the next lie. It didn't seem to me, and I want to be told otherwise, that in previous elections, in previous periods in American history, there was such a kind of anarchic free-for-all of prevarication. This seemed to be somehow a kind of culmination where we then, from, I guess, 88, began a new period in line. Do you read that similarly or not?
Well, Bush was Reagan's vice president. I would begin it with Reagan. I'd say two things. First of all, as a historian, I got to say things were pretty bad at the beginning of this country's history too. Like Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson, they have their analogous personalities in the early part of the century. Early part of the country's history. But things calmed down quite a bit. And again, with Reagan, and then as you say, with Bush and Atwater, things started to go awry that led directly to Trump. Part of it was the implicit racism of Reagan's announcement speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Atwater's Willie Horton ads, etc. Now, one thing I am proud of in my career is that I didn't invent the phrase "working the refs," but I found it and I popularized it. And in my book, What Liberal Media, I spent a lot of time with it. It originally was spoken by George Herbert Walker Bush, the head of the Republican Party at that time. Atwater was the campaign manager. A guy named Rich Bond, who's lost to history except for this quote, said that that he knew the media weren't that liberal, even though Republicans were always saying that they were. But what he was doing was working the refs. And the more you hassle the ref, the more likely the ref is likely to throw you a few calls just to shut you up. And what the conservative movement did was create this enormous, incredibly well-funded structure to hassle the media, to try and get the media to report stories the way that they saw them, regardless of what was true or not. And the media didn't need the hassle. So they threw them a few calls and tried to see things from their point of view so that they would maybe go away. But it's like one of those Japanese monsters in the 1950s movies like Godzilla. When you shoot it with a nuclear weapon, it just grows bigger and stronger and eats more of your city. So the more calls that they were given, the more they grew stronger and did it more and more. And now, and I think it happens all the time. So that actually, if you go back and look at the coverage of people saying that Obama wasn't born in this country, you're not going to get a very clear picture of whether or not Obama was born in this country, because they want to be respectful of the views of people who don't happen to share their values. They're not willing to take a stand. And this has been reinforced by this right-wing media that constantly is fighting this battle and working the rest. So, I don't know how to say this, because on the one hand, I'm enormously sympathetic to the problems that journalists face, particularly in this area when, if you look outside the New York Times and the Washington Post and MSNBC and CNN and a few other places, it's an enormous crisis of survival. Margaret Sullivan has just published a very good book on the crisis we're facing for all local news. It's disappearing. It's very hard to make a good living, to make a profit in this country, and report the news in a straightforward, accurate way. So I have a great amount of sympathy for that on the one hand. On the other hand, if you're going to play along with the undermining of truth, then why are you in this business in the first place? And there's just too much of that. There's just too much of people saying, well, Fox News is reporting it this way, so we have to pay attention and give credence to that, even though we know it's nonsense. And that I promise you, that's the way it's understood.
Maya?
Yeah, I look, it's like this. Which straw broke the camel's back? All of them, right? So this media piece is critically important. We can't lose two things that Lee Atwater admitted to for this conversation. One is, he said, if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. And so this is this intentionality around listening to folks, going around the South in particular and listening to where and how he could use a communication strategy to pull out and draw upon their fears and form their opinions based on them. It's not a small thing. But even more importantly, Lee Atwater admitted in a conversation with a political scientist that he did not know necessarily would ultimately get punished, about the discipline that really was the beginnings of understanding how to manipulate racism to meet and achieve the ends you want. And that is as long a history of the country as anything. He said, and this is a paraphrase, but almost a quote, he said, you start by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. But then, the civil rights movement happens. That starts backfiring on you. So then you start to say things like busing, crime. And then you get so good that all you have to say is taxes. But his point was the entire foundation was built up over years, and some folks have tracked it all the way back to the organizing that began to retrench from the New Deal, and from the opportunities that racial justice was pushing for in what would become the second reconstruction of the civil rights movement. So I don't think we can understand anything about how we unpack that. Of course, we need information. But if you look at textbooks in this country, they have been captured as well. Even what we're learning in schools has become difficult to get a full history and accounting of what racism has meant in this country, whether we're talking about Native Americans, Japanese internment, or chattel slavery in the civil rights movement. Any number of experiences are not even adequately taught as we continue to find ourselves having a harder and harder time living anywhere near each other, going to school together, having any experiences that create a foundation for undermining exactly what's been manipulated over decades. And Lee Atwater was just one of the many. He wasn't new, he wasn't unique, he was just good at it.
Yeah. Can I speak to? I actually thank you, Maya. I actually knew Lee Atwater really well. Ironically, when I was still in my 20s, one of my biggest moments in my career was I got an assignment from the New York Times Magazine to profile Lee Atwater right after George Bush won the election, and I traveled with him. And I have to say, I've never had more fun than I did with Lee Atwater. He was really fun, and that's part of it.
He was a musician.
He was a good old boy. Yeah, he played in a band. He wasn't very good, but he knew how to have a good time. I could tell you stories that I'm not going to now any more than I'm going to talk about the election. But there's two things I want to say in response to what Maya said about it. Number one is, I wrote a history of American liberalism from post-war era called The Cause. It's my last big book. I think it came out in 2012. And it's a good book. Everybody should buy it. But when I wrote that book, and for most of my life, I was a class man rather than a race man, because I felt like race has always been used to divide people by class, and you could improve everyone's lives, particularly people of color, if you put race aside and let people unite via their class interests. And I've given that up because race is just too central. It's too important. It's too important.
Wait a second, Eric. I just want to get this straight. This was until 2012?
Yeah.
All right. Keep going. Keep going.
By the way, let me now about Lee Atwater, but just to complicate that point I made a little bit, Lee Atwater was definitely exploiting race, no question, with the Willie Horton ads. But he was also doing something else, which is what we see with Trump and with the entire Republican Party. It was very much a narrow us against them, and the them doesn't have to be people of color. It can be anyone who is not you. There was a candidate. I don't have the details exactly in my head, although if you watch the movie, I talk about it there. There was a Jewish candidate for governor of South Carolina who was the mayor of one of the cities of South Carolina at the time. And he was a Democrat, and he had a good chance of winning the governorship. He raised some money in New York, and that was a problem because who lives in New York? But Atwater did some research, and he found out that the thing that people found most objectionable about a hypothetical candidate was that he did not accept Jesus Christ as his personal savior. They didn't mind if he was Jewish. They minded that he did not accept Jesus Christ as his personal savior. So
did anyone tell him Jesus was Jewish?
So they recruited a used car salesman, literally a used car salesman, to run as a third-party candidate. He was incredibly well-funded somehow, and he campaigned against this guy, this Jewish guy, because he didn't accept Jesus Christ as his personal savior. And that's how they won the governor's race in South Carolina that year. So that one wasn't about race. The problem was I was a Jew, but he wasn't one of us. Okay, so Trump and the Republican, much of the Republican Party, they don't really care if you know that they're lying or not. That's not what's important. Are you one of us or not? And this tribalism, which race is at the center of, it's obviously not the only part of it, is their only hope. It's tribalism combined with, as Maya says, restricting the vote. And they're hoping they can get one more election out of it, and that will be all they need. And they may be right. And that's my greatest concern right now as an American.
I want to make sure we got around 15 minutes, give or take. Got a bunch of questions, but there's one special one that just came in by a woman who is a graduate, recent graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, BA in Political Science and Education Policy Studies, on Eve Alterman, who has a fascinating sounding question, if I may, in which Ms. Alterman asks, lying is not only deceitful, but it's a product of a refusal to take accountability for one's mistakes. Recent movements like BLM and Me Too stress the general culture of a lack of accountability amongst those in power, whether it's in the police department or sexual harassment in the office. Trump's accountability allergy, Ms. Alterman says, has taken lying to an entirely unprecedented level, even in the age of fact-checking at our fingertips. How can we move forward in New York City or in the US when the truth is no longer valued? What types of systems can we put in place, she asked, to restore the importance of telling the truth? This is a meta question by a recent University of Wisconsin-Madison graduate. If it's all right, Eric, I might just start with Maya here and then.
I was going to say, I've got a feeling that this incredibly erudite and eloquent question is addressed to someone whose views just Ms. Alterman might respect, and that could only be Maya.
Maya, please.
Well, I don't even know what to say. It's a brilliant question from no doubt a brilliant woman, and I think that here's the thing: I'm not really ready to accept the premise that people don't care about the truth, and again. But I absolutely agree with the premise that there's been a complete failure of accountability, and that's my point about going to institutions and people and systems that start cheating. And I think that's true sometimes of policing, just as it's true in terms of the way we see political parties start to behave around voting rights. And I think the honest truth is we're seeing people demand the accountability in quite effective ways. It's called protesting. It's called organizing and demonstrating. It's called a complete refusal to enable and to do anything other than to challenge the institutions that are not functioning as we, the people, have mandated that they function. And I do think that matters tremendously. I think it has mattered and has been manifest at local levels. I think we have seen, as a result of demonstrations, an incredible forced responsiveness even by even local electeds who maybe not because they were completely without any accountability, as we've seen in the context of Donald Trump, but who have nevertheless maybe taken paths of least resistance rather than being more bold and transformational where necessary. And the very act of democratic practice, which includes protest, has created a form of forced accountability, both of people and institutions, in ways that I think matter dramatically. And I don't think there's anything more encouraging than the fact that they've been multiracial, than the fact that we've seen even multi-generational protesters in many places, and that it has created a context in which I have never seen this kind of poll before in my life, where 6 in 10 Republicans say that race is a significant issue in the United States. That is a sea change, and it's one that can only be credited with activism and organizing. And it didn't just happen because of George Floyd. It has been happening since Trayvon Martin, and also in ways outside of the issues of police brutality, not because it's not critical, but it's not even the only way, as Me Too also demonstrates, as we think about the Women's March right after the election in 2016. So I think the amount of democratic engagement and practice has increased, and the openness of the American public to have a much more honest confrontation with the question of things like race and democracy and immigration and our systems of accountability are what gives me hope, and are certainly one of the things I'm grateful for Open Society for funding. And also critically important because it creates a space and opportunity also for the news media to step up and start to push even harder on the facts. So I'll stop there and thank you for the question.
Thanks, Maya. Eric, something to add on that, please.
Yeah, I got to say, I have a daughter who's 22 years old, recent graduate of University of Wisconsin, Madison, and I've despaired in recent times of the world that we're leaving her. The fact that global warming may be insurmountable, and so many problems are being let slide on purpose, and the inequality. We haven't talked about inequality today, but it's in some ways the most fundamental problem we have: economic inequality. And I have a PhD and a couple of master's degrees. I've written 11 books. I think I know what I'm doing. But this Black Lives Movement has so surprised me and so enlightened me and so made me feel proud to be an American. Because I didn't think it was possible. I thought we were all beaten down. I thought television had, people thought, you write a check or you click on something and you tweet about it and that's the end of it and that's all people's actions. But they're out there and they're facing physical danger, and they're refusing to back down, and it's beautiful and it's meaningful and it's inspirational, and it's made me feel much more optimistic about the country that we're leaving our young people, even though, Christ, what a mess we are also leaving at the same time. But it's not hopeless, and I don't feel hopeless in the way I did before this happened, and so I just want to say thank you to those people who are out there for doing that, and I'm grateful.
And can we just
Great.
throw in, because that's so moving, but it's also true of Indigenous people on climate change. It's there. One of the things that's so wonderful is there's been so many fronts on which communities have been organizing on so many issues, and that there's more interaction between them. I just think that's something that it also gives.
Can I ask Maya a question? Maya, it was my understanding that Black Lives Matter was a net win for Trump in 2016, that sort of scare tactic. Are you as surprised as I am by the embrace that it's gotten from middle-class Americans, even Republicans, as you say? I'm wonderfully shocked and surprised.
I'm not, although as I said, I'm shocked about the opinion polls, but I'm not really shocked because I think we've always seen it in the context of Black organizing for racial justice in this country. It's been true. It was true in the fight for abolition of slavery. It was true in the fight to hold on to Reconstruction. It was true in what we call the second Reconstruction, which was the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s. I think the fact that it is always the first refrain to say, be afraid of those folks. And the reality is, because the work doesn't stop, and because there was and has been so much more opportunity, and I think this generation, the generation that represents recent graduates from the University of Madison, and Gen Z as a whole, they have much more of a framework of intersectional analysis, of saying, our fates are linked. If it's happening to Indigenous people with the pipeline, it's also destroying our environmental health. If it's police violence in Black communities, we got to care about that too. If it's immigration at the borders, that's our issue. That there's been this tremendous building for years now. It's not, I don't see it as a recent phenomenon, but I think it's not surprising to me, the fact that it hasn't gone away. And the fact that it's something that has become a reckoning, because it's been very intentional. And I think Black Lives Matter in particular as a movement has been very intentional as well about having those conversations across community. And the students in Parkland, for that matter, in terms of gun violence, and really recognizing that it's not just the mass shooters, it's also what's happening in gun violence in communities of color. So I'm just so impressed by the fact that we have a generation of folks who've been reaching across community to find their common humanity. And that is what's so important here.
Thank you. That's very moving. But I would just like to move it back to one point, which is the importance of truth. George Floyd will go down in history because we saw it. There was no denying it. And it was so powerful, when you see it now, it's still kind of unbelievable. You can barely stand to see it. And I think it's just as important. Campaign finance is important too. We used to talk about you can't move forward unless you get rid of all the money that's all on one side. But you also can't move forward, as Hannah Arendt said, unless you can agree on reality, unless you can agree on what's out there, to make the pictures in our heads match the world outside. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would say that the purpose of my book is to try and get people to demand the truth, to demand that the people are responsible. It's largely the media, but it's not only the media. It's all of these establishment institutions who have the privilege of defining the pictures in our heads. I mean, thank God for OSF, and really, it sounds sappy, but for George Soros, who has dedicated his life to doing this at great personal cost. I've written a lot about that. But Soros is a symbol. He's the Antichrist in the eyes of so many people, because he's not giving up on this fight, because he is insisting on demanding that we hold true to these truths and these values. And I think we shouldn't just leave it to George and to OSF and to the few people who are fighting. I think we need to demand it of the people who run our leading institutions. I don't think Rupert Murdoch should be treated with respect. I think he should be held to account for destroying democracy, for undermining our abilities to deal with climate change, etc. And I'm using him as an example, but there's lots of people like that. And I think if you read my book, I'm sorry to sound like I'm plugging my book, but it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process of the undermining of truth, of the enemies of shared reality. And we can't, Maya just spoke so movingly about intersectionality and the shared reality of different groups, but we can't move forward without that. And that's what these people are trying to destroy, and that's what we need together to unite. It's a step-by-step process. George Floyd was kind of easy, because my God, the guy's neck, he had his elbow on his neck, but the rest of the world is more complicated than that. And we need to find a way to demand truth from our institutions so that we can force our society to reflect the values that we share.
So look, this is, we have so many more questions, because there's so many hundreds of people listening to this vital and searching, really, conversation. And I want to thank you so much. Got a little welled up, I must say, listening to your comments about George Soros, whose birthday is tomorrow as he reaches nonagenarian status. A happy birthday to him. But Eric, feel no compunction about publicizing your book. What the hell are we doing here? Anyway, so that this is all about publicizing your book. And it is here, lying in state, from Basic. Buy it. It's really an exceptional story, and not an easy one, but a necessary one. And so first, I want to thank my old friend Maya Wiley for all the time that you have taken here. It's so lovely to be in conversation with you, and I'd like to thank my new friend Eric Alterman for giving us this opportunity to celebrate you and your book, and only the best of luck with it.
Thank you so much to everyone involved. I lack the words to say how grateful I am for this opportunity. And I don't usually
thank you for your daughter. I just want to thank you for your daughter.
All right. Good night and good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you.